Hello, I'm Paul Gruba, an honorary fellow at the School of Languages and Linguistics, University of Melbourne. Today's presentation is Listening to Semiotic Resources. As we begin, I would like to thank Russ Sudovov and Van Nguyen. Russ helped me place ideas in the wider world, and of course, Van, through her study and her research, provided a context for them. For me, listening research has inspired. Why pursue an academic career in this area? And it was a single quote that really got me going. Listening is the basis for action. And I thought to myself, what a great field. Listening is indeed the basis for action. But for 30 years, I've been frustrated with my inability to theorize video-based listening. And that was my PhD area. It certainly took up a lot of my time over the last 30 years. But I got heart from defining listening from the International Listening Association. It's the process of receiving, constructing meaning from, and responding to spoken and or nonverbal messages. And it's really important to stick to this definition as we continue throughout this conference and indeed throughout this presentation. So for listening researchers, and indeed my own research agenda has been, what is the role of the nonverbal in messages? And what does it mean to construct meaning from the nonverbal? And for us in the current field, how do we shift from a psycholinguistic view to a social view of listening? And the other thing I would like to say is nonverbal could simply be social semiotics or semiotic resources. Okay? So technology and new media and the nonverbal. Or here the nonverbal is simply semiotic resources because then we can put in the verbal and we don't need to keep making a distinction as if they were hard and fast differences. So how can listening theory keep pace and indeed be relevant? Much of our teaching, keeping pace and being relevant, and what our students expect actually involves video clips, or as I would like to call them, video text, and indeed the nonverbal or semiotic resources. I use the term video text to signal that our work aligns with research on text, with text, and through text, as in the other fields of reading and writing. If we call it clips, we align with the fields of media studies and media production and advertising. We want to stick with the fields that we're familiar with, textual analysis, reading, and writing analysis. So how does research or listening research align with contemporary second language acquisition or SLA research? So contemporary, or even my apologies, even 2016, so this is a decade old, but to many people, this is still somehow a surprise. So the Douglas Fir Group, which is a prominent team of experts, SLA experts, proposed that we adopt a transdisciplinary framework for SLA in a multilingual world. They want to explicitly recognize learner mobility, global diversity, and new technology. And these experts write that language learning is semiotic learning. What does that mean to listening research? And again, this has been a decade old, so it's not necessarily contemporary. But at the heart of their three-tier framework sits semiotic resources. And if we could just pause here for a moment. So at the macro level of ideological structures, there's belief systems, cultural values, political values, religious and economic values. That's the micro level. At the meso level, there's social identity, investment, agency, power, families, neighborhood, social organizations. And at the micro level of social activity is semiotic resources. So I just want to highlight, they're not talking about cognitive activity. They're talking about micro level of social activity. So linguistic, prosodic, nonverbal, pictorial, auditory, artificial. And this is where individuals engage with others. And of course, it's underpinned by neurobiological mechanisms and cognitive capacities. But that's almost at the underpinning. It's not, we're really at the micro level of social activity. So I just want to highlight here that the Douglas Fir Group defines semiotic resources as an open set. So just remind ourselves it's open. It's not a closed set. It's not defined and that's it. It's open. It can change. Ever evolving, of course, multilingual, multimodal possibilities or options for making meaning. So these meaning potentials of all semiotic resources are considered affordances in the local emergent context of use. They enable certain possible construals of experience by their users and certain possible interpretations by recipients. They put hearers here, but I don't know why they put hearers and not listeners and readers. And I added the emphasis, of course. In practice, this concept points to the multimodal nature of human communication, that we interact through touch, sight, sound, and many, many other ways, of course, through these resources for meaning making. That, and it's important to remember, these do not guarantee that we're understood. There's a very, 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 very brief background that semiotic resources are grounded in systemic functional linguistics. And this area attempts to account for an inherently socially negotiated nature of language through broad areas of three metafunctions. So ideational, it's used to express concepts; interpersonal, how we work within relationships; and textual, how language can be organized, structured, and patterned. So these different metafunctions interplay as we communicate and indeed try to make meaning from the socially negotiated nature of language when we use language. So if we believe in this, we already listen to semiotic resources, right? That is, we make sense of the world through what's being signaled through voice, action, gesture, pragmatics, tone, pace, for example. Remember, though, we're so accustomed to a view of listening as understanding parts of language or aspects of grammar that somehow we lose sight of what it means to make meaning. And for the life of me, why do we continue to take a structural view of language or a psycholinguistic view of language that even a cognitive interactionist views of language acquisition? Expert SLA theorists from 2016 have asked us to move on. I just kind of want to say it's time to move on. It's been a decade now. This is not new information for us. And a quick challenge for you. If you were an instructor, or many of you in fact are instructors, which of these semiotic resources do you think is most important to master when understanding an argument in a second language? Pitch and intonation, so a question or a demand. Speech rate, I speed up or I slow down to be threatening. Silence, parsing or pausing. Interpreting what a long beat or hesitation says about a character's reaction. So, which one do you think provides the clearest sign for an intermediate learner who's trying to understand arguments in a second language? In our research study, this is part of a larger, in a sense, collaborative work with Vaughn. So Vaughn is currently working in risk discourse in parts of the government here in Victoria. But part of her larger study was risk discourses in Vietnamese society. And this present focus for us, part of this larger study, is how do Vietnamese women perceive the portrayal of risk? And really what it boils down to is a case study. 12 professional Vietnamese women discussed their views of helmet safety campaign on video that encouraged parents to put a helmet on their children when they were riding on motor scooters. And you can just get an idea of it from this next screen. So the children can dream, but they can also die. So please wear helmets was basically what was happening. There's a lot of scenes of children pursuing dreams and being happy with their family. And then there's a funeral. And then there's a flashback from the mother saying, if only we had put a helmet on our child before moving. And again, this is, I don't know, perhaps novel to listening research, but it was grounded, lived, ethnographic. It was not in a science lab. It was not in a timed eye tracking technology. It did not have a psycholinguistic view. It had a social view of language. So it was ethnographic and indeed auto-ethnographic. And like all of her participants, Vaughn herself is educated female and a Vietnamese professional. And these discussions of the video text took place over a series of months in an informal, friendly environment in Vietnam. And then afterwards, Vaughn and I debriefed. She transcribed the material. we got it reviewed by the participants themselves, and the entire study was engaged and ethical. But you can imagine it was informal, friendly, engaged, ethical, sitting down and talking. And these are the three key findings we came up. The first one was interest. So when listening to semiotic resources, listeners calibrate the effort needed in relation to what motivates their effort and aligns with their effort. So this concept recognizes the point that listeners have different agency and intentionality as they negotiate meaning based on what they want from the clip. Okay? So we know that, of course, motivation, it's a cognitive concept, is a key factor in instructor, but we like the term or prefer the term what interests them because it takes into account the complex life experience of listeners themselves. Some listeners have been poor, are rich, are famous, are feeling diminished, etc., etc. So what interests them when they listen to a video clip, for example, a video text? And it turns out in this study, the Vietnamese listeners varied their interpretation on risk partly on the basis of their marital, economic, or career status. Did they feel that they themselves could see themselves as parents putting helmets on their children, or were they kind of above the risk, or it didn't interest them, or of course they wouldn't do that because they were quote unquote too smart. Another key finding was culture. So culture in social semiotic terms means a repository of shared semiotic resources, which is a good way to think of it. When we enact our culture, we draw on a repository of shared semiotic resources. And this helps us justify how we make meaning of elements. In semiotic terms, culture is not a fixed concept, but that resides in the individual learner. But it's shaped and understood through widely shared social norms. For example, someone who dresses nice are nice people, for example. So it turns out the Vietnamese listeners highlight semiotic resources displayed by the actors to explain the interpretation of elements. So again, they're drawing on multiple semiotic resources to make sense of how that's culturally appropriate. And they're drawing on this repository of semiotic resources. So it's not a fixed thing. They're drawing, they're making different interpretations. Each of the 12 listeners had a different or slightly different or sometimes radically different interpretation of what was being advertised or promoted in these risk discourse videos. Engagement. Listeners are constrained now by the way the video texts lead them to preferred and dispreferred interpretations. So, of course, the use and portrayal of semiotic resources influences meaning making. That's very, very obvious. But probably the easiest way to kind of illustrate this is that there were only opposite sex couples shown in the Vietnamese advertisements. And these restricted the depiction of context or meaning of what a family could be or what risk could be. And indeed, what was valued in Vietnamese society, or certainly middle-class Vietnamese society. And indeed, this influenced the way a listener viewed the concept. This begins to uncover for us as listeners or listening theory concepts like influence, marketing, even, for example, propaganda, manipulation. So in summary, what have we learned? Placing semiotic resources at the heart of SLA theory challenges listening theorists to align with, I would say, contemporary, but they're actually 2016 views. These are decade old. So we really should focus more on listening to semiotic resources. Structural linguistics, in my mind, doesn't offer a sufficient basis for understanding semiotic resources. And systemic functional linguistics is grounded in social activity. And this cognitive interactionist views of SLA highlight individual reactions to input. But again, in my mind, they're insufficient to account for a multi-level view of listening. Indeed, multi-level view of listening as a social activity. And let's just think for a second on a pedagogical design, layered task design. So we have 30 seconds for the video text. We pause. We ask, based on your gestures and sitting, who holds the power in the conversation when it's an argument? Then we turn on the audio without the video and we ask, does that tone of their voice match the power dynamic that you saw earlier? And finally, when we put it all together, a multimodal synthesis, they watch and listen together. We ask, what specific word or phrase or action did they finally use to settle the argument? And in this way, we can start teaching language as a social semiotic or social resource and listening to semiotic resources. Throughout this presentation, I've touched on the micro level of the Douglas fir design, but could also touch on macro listening. So listening to ideology, listening to propaganda, listening to the news, listening to political messages, so that it implies such and such a position is right. How do students unpack or interpret what is right and not right? We could also design main meso-level tasks, for example, to detect the tenor of social relationship, who has power, what is being suggested by certain words, or in fact, the semiotic interpretation of words, or how they are resources, and indeed, what will happen next in the conversation, so we can begin to really unpack what we think is going to happen to help our students with their predictive capability in second languages. So for me, as I said, the reason I got into listening researches is because it's the basis for action. And I certainly encourage everyone at this conference to consider systemic functional linguistics, these concepts to provide a theoretical and conceptual basis for research concerning semiotic resources, which again aligns with contemporary SLA, which again aligns with insisting that listening truly involves the process of receiving, constructing meaning from, and responding to spoken and or nonverbal messages. The way I would modify this is responding to semiotic resources. Rather than saying spoken and or nonverbal, I would simply cluster all those together, responding to semiotic resources. Many thanks to everybody for coming and for listening today. All the best for the conference, and in particular, huge thanks to Monica and to the team.